Good morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are. Thanks so much for joining. This is our last session, and I'm going to give you this heads up in advance that it's going to be a long session. So I'm not going to stop at the hour. I will speak for at least 90 minutes or longer. So I would like to make sure that I cover more. I cannot say that's cover as much as I would want because there are a lot of other things I want to say. And when I was reviewing the content of today's session, I was thinking to myself, oh, I cannot say this. I cannot, I do not have time for it. So I'm going to just browse through the stories of Shahnameh. This is the topic of our last sessions. We have done a few of the kings already. We've talked about Qumars, Hushang, Tahmuris, Jamshid, and a bit about Zahak. Zahak is not finished. So almost 4.5 kings, and we have 50. So I'm going to talk about many more, but don't worry, the Sasanian kings, the last, I think, 26, if I'm not mistaken, those are, I'm not going to talk about all of them. There are a few important kings that I'm going to emphasize on, but the rest I'm going to just browse through and I may not even mention their names. So, but let's see how much we can do, how much we can cover. And at the end, I'm going to have a quiz for you and a project. So we are going to talk about the project as well, so that hopefully you will do at the end of the class, because this is what I was asked to do. All right. Let's start and talk about Zahak. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go through the details of the stories. So I'm going to just highlight a few things that I want to mention about each one of the stories. I'm not going to tell you the story. You know the story. I'm going to touch on a few parts of the story, but not the whole story. That might be even good idea. So I'm not going to spoil some of the stories for you. Some of them I will, but this might encourage you to go and actually read the stories because they're awesome. Okay, so about Zahak, we talked about Zahak and where he came from. I briefly mentioned that in our mythology, Zahak is named Ajidahak, is just a dragon, is not a human, is a dragon with 3 heads. And that also, I think I mentioned that not only about Zahak, but a few other characters of Shahnameh, which come from the Indo-Iranian era, from the times that the Indians and Iranians lived together. And that's why we see very similar characters in the Indian mythology. So, for example, Zahak is one of those. Ajidahak is one of those. So in the Indian mythology, we have a dragon, a 3-headed dragon, exact same way, and his name is Das or Dasa. And so there are other indications that these two are the same thing, besides having just 3 heads. So one of them is just, for example, in Avesta, we have that Zahag at some point, or actually Hag, fights Azar. Azar is the angel of this is fire, right? And we have a similar thing. Just it's a fight that we have between this Ajidahak or Dasa and something very similar, which is basically, I think, the god of light or something like this. So we have that too. However, another aspect to that, which makes it very similar, is that what happens to Zahak at the end. We know that according to Shahnameh, Zahak is defeated by Feridun. Feridun is in Avesta. Feridun's name is Thratona. Thratona exists in Avesta. I mentioned about Aban Yasht, in which all these, not all, the many kings or many characters come one after another and they sacrifice. They sacrifice to Arduf Sur Anahit and then ask for something. And Ajidahak did that. That dragon wanted to eliminate all the human beings. And that's why also refer to one verse of Shahnameh, which says the exact same thing, but not about him, not about Zahak, because Zahak is just a human. It talks about Iblis want to do that. Iblis, the devil, wants to do this. But basically, these two are the two aspects of the same character in our myths. But in the next verse in that Yash, the same Yash, Aboniasht, we hear that Thratona makes a wish and does sacrifices, and he wants to be able to defeat Ajdahak. And says that Ajdahak is the worst creation of Ahriman, the worst creation of Ahriman. This is very important, and that's why Ajdahak or Zahak is the worst character of Shahnameh. Is the worst by far. The next one is Afrasiab that we will talk about, right? So we see this in Avestan, and Thratona is that character, and the name of his father is Asvia, which is turned into Aptin in Shahnameh. If you look at the Indian mythology, we have the name of this character as Tritana, Thratona, Tritana, and his father's name is Atpia, Aptia. Atpin or Asvia versus Aptia. Same character, obviously, right? So in Shahnameh, so we have the story of Feridun being the person that is first Zahak sees him in his dreams. He does not know who that person is. He's asking somebody to interpret his dream, and nobody dares to do that for 3 days. So he sees in dreams that somebody comes, just grab him, just take him down from his throne and just chain him and just drags him with. So he asks the advisors to interpret his dreams, and nobody dares until somebody says that, okay, this is what happens to you. This character is Feridun. He's not born yet, and he's going to be born, and he's going to defeat you, and he's going to be the king after you. However, I just want to mention something very yet another beautiful thing about Shahnameh and about what Ferdowsi does. So in this moment, Ferdowsi feels that this is a teachable moment. This is a place where he wants to give us advice. Ferdowsi gives us a lot of advice, sometimes from his own words, sometimes from his character's mouth. So they speak and just give advice. In this case, it's very interesting that you imagine that Zahak, that horrific, terrifying character, ask the advisors to tell him what's the meaning of that dream, and nobody dares to say anything for 3 days. So imagine how terrifying this moment is. However, the person whose name is Zirak means clever in Persian. His name is Zirak. Zirak is one of those advisors that dares to speak, but he does not start saying that, oh, I'm really sorry to say this, and somebody comes like Feridun's name, blah, blah, blah. He does not start with that. He starts with these sentences. He says, بدو گفت پردخته کن سرز باد که جز مرگ را کس مادر نزاد. جهاندار پیش از تو بسیار بود که تخت مهی را سزاوار بود. فراوان غم و شادمانی شمرد برفت و جهان دیگری را سپرد. اگر باره آهنینی به پای سپهرت بساید نمانی به جای. So the gist of this 4 verses is that give up your pride and selfishness. No one is going to escape from death. Start with this teaching that, okay, don't think that you're going to live forever, even though you have lived for 1,000 years, but that's not going to happen. So you are going to die. And many kings were before you, and they deserved to be the kings. So, and this is interesting, they deserve to be the king, but at the end they died and left their throne to the next person. And it's going to happen to you as well. Another interesting thing is that right after he tells him that Feridun is going to come and defeat him, drags him and takes him with him, he asks, why? Why does he do that to me? And then again, he says that, remember, nobody will do harm for no reason. Nobody does bad for no reason. دلاور بدو گفت اگر بخردی کسی بی بهانه نسازد بدی. Again, he gives him advice. He gives us advice. He says that know that nobody will do bad for no reason. You have done bad, and that's why you see bad. You see that somebody does this to you. And then he says that, okay, you kill his father and you kill the cow that feed him, and that's why he does this to you. Anyway, I move on. I go into the story of Feridun. Feridun getting is born, and you know that his mom Faranak is a very brave woman. By the way, we don't have the name of Faranak in our myth, so we have it in Shahnameh, but we have his father's name, not the mother. But in Shahnameh we have Faranak, and Faranak is, in fact, is the first female character that we have in Shahnameh, besides Shahnaz and Arnavaz, which are just names yet. But these are the this is the brave woman that rescues his son, her son, and takes him to a farm, and then with that magical cow, Barmaye, and feed and ask the farmer to feed him from his milk, from her milk. But anyway, so another thing I want to mention here is the cow. Why cow? We should know, and you already know, cow is very important in the Indo-Iranian beliefs from ancient past. We already see that very more prevalent in India today. But it was still very precious and valuable and respectable in the Iranian mythology. I just mentioned about the story of, a few sessions back, I mentioned the story of creation from the Iranian perspective, and the story of Qumars, and how Ahriman and Ahura Mazda both create different things, and then they fight each other and blah, blah, blah. One of the main animal, or the only animal that is created, is a cow. And that cow is killed by Ahriman, and she dies. And then I think from her body, the other animals were created, and I think metal is created or something else. So all of these come from a cow. So cow is important. And is also related to Feridun. The title of Feridun's dad is a cow. Or basically they had from coming from a family who had cows. And you see that Feridun is bound to the story of this cow and the mace that he has, and he asks basically the blacksmith to build for him is cow-headed, right? So this is another thing. And we also have the name Gav in Shahnameh, which means Pahlavan, means hero. But Gav is Gav. Gav is cow. Comes from that word. So we see that throughout Shahnameh. And the name of this cow is Barmaye in Shahnameh. But remember, I gave you some examples last time where Ferdowsi invented some names or changed some names. Faribors, Bors Fari, Farangiz, Gis Fari. This is another example. The name of this cow in other sources is Barmayun, not Barmaye, but he changed the name because it did not fit in the metric of Shahnameh, in the style of Shahnameh. So anyway, this was another thing I wanted to mention about this story. And we know that at the end, Feridun grows up, and then he comes back and talks to his mom and asks her, okay, where I come from and who was my dad. And then he hears the story from his mom, and then wants to go and just fight Zahak. And mom says that, okay, it's not time, just wait. And then the story of Kaveh, the blacksmith. So another highlight here is the way that Feridun talks to his mom. He's very respectful, very nice. He asked his mom this question. Why I'm saying this? Because compare this to this, and yet another story which is very simple, the story of Rostam and Sohrab. When Sohrab grows up, he goes to his mom and ask who I am. He says that, okay, I'm so strong. I'm much stronger than my peers. Where do I come from? So who's my dad? And then he does not say that in a nice way. He says that, okay, tell me or I kill you. So this is the way that he talks to his mom. So Robbie's arrogant from the beginning. Compare that to Feridun, who's a very nice gentleman. So I just wanted to just give you that contrast. And the other thing that I may mention a few times throughout our conversation today is that some of the themes repeat a lot over and over again, not only in Shahnameh, in the entire realm of myths. Because there's a story, there's a beautiful story, and people keep repeating that. And they said, oh, this formula works. When they want to come up with another story or they see something similar, it converges to that. So we see this pattern over and over again. For example, the 7 labors of Rustam. Rustam goes through the 7 different stages or 7 different challenges and defeat 7 different evils to be able to just reach Kavus, who's in Mazandaran and is chained by the white demon. It goes there and to rescue Kekavus and the army of Iran. It goes through these 7 stages. We have the exact same theme for Esfandiar. Esfandiar has also 7 labors. And some of the phases or stages are very similar. So this is just one example. We have many, many more. But this is what I just wanted to mention. So again, I have to move on from here, from the story of Feridun. But at the end of the story of Feridun, we know that and the story at the end of the story of Zahak, we know that Zahak is chained by Feridun, but is not killed. And we know that Sorush comes here. So when we see Sorush, this is a Zoroastrian symbol. So nobody, just no other Zoroastrian, no one other than Zoroastrians know deeply who Sorush is. It's like, oh, Sorush came? Who's Sorush? It was because Sorush is also a boy's name. So this is the way that Iranians have heard this, the non-Zoroastrians have heard this name, but they don't know that Sorush is actually an angel. It's just one of the Izads, right? So, and he's also the messenger, Izad. He's a messenger from God. So when he comes and says something, he's bringing a message. And we see that he comes and talks to Feridun and says that don't kill Zahak. It's not his time. You need to take him to the mountains, Mount Elborz, and chain him there. But why? This is also a question that many people have asked over the years and asked me a lot. But to get the answer, again, we need to return to our myths. According to that creation story, and the story that at the end of the 12,000 years, I told you that Zahak is eventually killed by Krasaspa or Garshasp, right? That big hero of Iran, which is completely missing from Shahnameh. So according to this myth, they say that if Zahak is killed, a lot of what is that? Some ugly creatures come out of his body and then take over the entire world. So these creatures are called Kharafastar in Avesta, and some of the animals or insects are believed to be as part of this one, like a snake or scorpions. These are the animals who are looked at negatively in Zoroastrianism. And that's the reason that it's hidden from Shahnameh. But that's why it says that do not kill Zahak. Is not his time. Right? So this is what we have. It's very common in Shahnameh. There are things that happen that we do not see the reason for it. But we know that from other sources, especially from Avesta and from our Zoroastrian text. For example, is another example. So is just a bit down these stories of Shahnameh that I'm going to talk about here, but I get back to that if I have time. And that's the story of Esfandiar. Rostam cannot defeat Esfandiar. Why? Because Esfandiar is Ruin Tan. Ruin Tan is that, I don't know what is a good term in English, but it's somebody who is, just give me a hint. So what is a good word for Ruin Tan in English? Somebody who cannot be defeated. So it's just
invincible.
Invincible is a very good term, but invincible is in general is a concept that you cannot be defeated. However, it is because he's tan means body. The body is ruin, is just body is like some iron or something like that cannot. I'm sorry,
metal bodied or something like
metal bodies. It doesn't necessarily say metal, but it's just a type of body that you cannot penetrate. So right, so it's very similar to Achilles, right? Achilles, we all have that in the Greek mythology. Anyway, so it says that he cannot be defeated because he's Ruin Tan. But why is he Ruin Tan? Shahnameh does not talk about it, but we know why. We have that in our myths that Zoroaster basically washed him in the holy water, and that's why he became Ruin Tan. And why he did that again is part of a story that where Gushtas wanted to accept Zoroastrianism. He first asked Zoroaster to go do a few things for him. One of them is that he said, I want to go to the other world and see my place in the heaven. That's one thing. The other thing is that I want my my vizier, Jamasp. Oh, actually, he first says that I want all of these for myself. He says that I want to go see my place in the other world. I want to be able to predict the future. I want to be able to see the future. And the other thing that I want to be Ruin Tan. Zartosh says, I cannot give all of these to one person, but I can give it to 3 different people. And that's why he takes Gushtas to the other world and see his place in heaven. So now he says, okay, I will go to heaven. That's good. And then he give Ruin Tan, make Esfandiar his son Ruin Tan, and then he give the third one to Jamasp. Jamasp, his vizier, is the person who sees the future. And we see that in Shahnameh as well, without any explanation. In the story that is actually narrated by Daghighi, that part of Shahnameh where Gushtas accepts Zoroastrianism, then Arjasp, the king of Turan, does not accept that. It does not. Apparently, both of them were in this had the same religion, but then Gushtas converts to Zoroastrianism, and there is a war between them because Arjasp is upset about this change of religion, or is just an excuse or taxation or whatever reason. So they have a fight, and then in that, when Gushtas wants to go to a war, ask Jamas, tell me what's going to happen. And Jamas tells the entire story. It's like a movie. He says that the first happens this. And one of the things that he says that is that your brother Zarir, your dear brother Zarir, so the two are very close. Your dear brother Zarir is going to be killed. And that Gushtas thinks that, then I do not even go to war. I do not send Zarir to the war. And Jamas said that no, you cannot change the destiny. And what's going to happen if you don't go to war? So Arjasp is coming anyway. You have to do it. So again, this is another thing that is not explained in Shahnameh. It's very common. There are a few places that are very famous in that regard. One of them is this, Esfandiar, Jamas. Why? And we see that in other stories. Surush is another one. Let's get back to the story of Zahak. Who's Surush and why he's saying not to kill Zahak. So anyway, so that's the end of Zahak's story. And then we go to Feridun. Feridun becomes a king. The first thing is that he sat on a throne and puts a crown on his head, and then everybody celebrates. And that celebration is Mehregan. So we have Mehregan, Sadeh, and Nowruz. The story of the three of them are in Shahnameh, and we hear about them over and over again. So, so many times in Shahnameh, it says that, oh, this is a good king. He came and then he revived Sadeh, Mehregan, and Nowruz. We hear that. So this is one example. The other one, so part of Shahnameh said that, oh, this is a very good king because he celebrated these festivals. So this is why these three were the important celebrations and festivals of Iranians in Shahnameh, and we see the story of all the three of them. Okay, so the story of Feridun, the main story is the story of Feridun and his three sons. So we know that when the sons are born from Shahnaz and Arnabaz. I told you that we have these characters. We have them in Aban Yasht, and Feridun wants to, these are the wives of Zahak, and Feridun wants them. And I told you that last time, I think, that after 1,000 years, these are still beautiful young ladies, and how is that possible? And I told you why. So get back to that session if you don't remember. But so the first two, the two older sons come from Shahnaz, and the third one from Arnabaz. And this is also an interesting point, that the third one, who's a good one, comes from a different mother. So anyway, so we have the story of their marriage, how the Feridun find three brides for them, and then after that, the story of Feridun testing his sons. That and he names them according to, based on what he sees from them. So, and the way that they react to a dragon, which is Feridun disguising himself as a dragon. So I move on from that, and then this then he devised the world among them, the west, east, and center, the middle. Obviously, the middle part goes to the better child, which is the youngest, Iraj, and the other two are jealous. After that, they ask father to just take that part from him, and then Iraj, so Feridun talks to Iraj and asks him to go to war with them. He warns him that, okay, your brothers are bad, they're evils. They want to get your land, and if you, and it says, I think let me just read the sentence. Oh, it says تو گر چاشت را دست یازی به جام وگر نی خورند ای پسر بر تو شام. It says that if you go, and basically it plays with the two words of breakfast and dinner. It says that if you eat breakfast on them, you are successful, you're triumphant. Otherwise, they're going to eat dinner on you. It means that if you don't go first, they'll come after you after that. And then this is the part that, again, Ferdowsi gives us advice from with Iraj's words. And it says, چون این داد پاسخ که شهریار نگه کن بر این گردش روزگار که چون باد بر ما همی بگذرد خردمند مردم چرا غم خورد. He said, father, look at this life. It's worthless. Everybody's going to die. Why should I bother? Why should I be worried about what I have and who I am? So Iraj is a very special character in Shahnameh. He's the most selfless character. And if you look at the Persian literature in the subsequent centuries, there's a concept called uh, Erfan. Erfan that you see in the words of Rumi and Hafiz. So they say that okay, do not care about what is in this life. It doesn't matter, and then you should. Some they even encourage people to just go sit somewhere and just do nothing and not care about anything in life. And we have an example of that in Shahnameh. There are Brahmans, which come from basically the Indian religion, right? So the Alexander Iskandar talks to them, has a dialogue with them. So I mentioned this one because I want to get back to the basically perspective of Ferdowsi himself. In this story, Alexander, who's going to go? Alexander is an explorer. So I'm going to talk about him. Alexander is want to see everything in the world. And one of the things, and he obviously takes army to each different parts of the world. One of the places is says that Sarzamin Berahmanha is the lands of Berahmans. He reaches that and he wants to go to war with them. And they said that we have nothing. We have no army. We have no riches. So if you want to come, come. So if you want to bring your army, bring your army. But we have nothing. And we don't have any money. We have nothing. But if you want advice, come to us. We give you advice. It's very beautiful, this part, that this dialogue in which Alexander asks questions from them and they answer. So they're very beautiful. Again, yet another type of advice that Ferdowsi gives from Brahman's perspective. But what I'm saying is that we have an example of this in Shahnameh, people who just sit at the corner and do nothing and do not care about anything. They do not collect any goods, any riches. However, this is not what Ferdowsi promotes. As you see in Shahnameh, it celebrates life. And he says that, okay, you should care about life in this world, because this is the mindset of Erfan in the subsequent centuries. Say that, okay, don't do anything in this world, just wait for the other one. The next one would be awesome. But that's not what we hear from Ferdowsi. This is not his ideology. And maybe some people believe that, okay, there is a reason that we see this kind of perspective from Iranians, because Iranians are defeated by Arabs and they give up after a while. They say that, okay, so we cannot do anything to take your back your country. So let us say that's okay, this is not even important. So that's one perspective from why we have Erfan in Iran. Anyway, so Iraj is a kind of character, not the character that says that, okay, I don't yeah, it's kind of, he says that, okay, I don't care, I don't want any of these, all of these could be theirs. And fair, and this is the kind of advice that he gives his dad. And then Feridun says, okay, so I think you're mistaken. So they are going to kill you, because Iraj says, I'm going to go and talk to them. And Feridun says that, okay, you're mistaken. You'll be killed. But I should learn from you that it's not surprising that I get such a such perspective from you. You have a beautiful soul. You are a good person. مرا این سخن یاد باید گرفت. ز مه روشنایی نیاید شگفت. It's not surprising that you see brightness and light from the moon. You are the moon. And this is another thing that he says. Anyway, so this happens. Iraj goes there, talks to them, and this is one part of Shahnameh that every time that I read, I really get emotional, because it's really emotional. The way that you see the contrast between these two views and this dialogue. It's not a dialogue. If one part says that I'm your brother, I like you guys, and I don't care about any of these. I go and find somewhere in the world and just live there on my own, and everything is yours. it gives them what they want. But anything that he says, anything he says, because of his beautiful heart and because of this nice character that he is, makes the other side, who's Tur, the second brother, makes him angrier and angrier and angrier. At the end, he grabs the golden chair or something that he's sitting on, and he hit him with that. And then he begs him. Iraj begs and says one sentence, which is a very famous. If I tell you that this is perhaps one of the most famous verses of Shahnameh, I'm not kidding. It says میازار موری که دانه کش است که جان دارد و جان شیرین خوش است. He says, don't harm the little ant who's alive and enjoys life. He compares himself with an ant, little ant. Says that I'm harmless. I do nothing bad to you. So don't harm an ant. Let him live because he's enjoying life. This is a very famous verse of Shahnameh. Why? Because a few centuries later, another giant of Persian poetry, Sa'di, refers to Ferdowsi with this word, with this verse. He says, چه خوش گفت فردوسی پاکزاد. He names Ferdowsi. چه خوش گفت فردوسی پاکزاد که رحمت بر آن تربت پاک باد. میازار موری که دانه کش است که جان دارد و جان شیرین خوش است. Sa'di has a story in which he wants to give us advice, as always, and then he says that listen to these beautiful words of Ferdowsi. God bless him. God bless his grave. This is the way they say. میازار موری که دانه کش است که جان دارد و جان شیرین خوش است. He refers to his verse. And there's a beautiful story around it. I do not have time to talk about this sentence a bit more. I just tell you this much, that the way that we see this verse in various manuscripts is completely different. There are different versions of this. In the version that Dr. Khaliqi Mutlaq believes that is just the real one, again, I told you about Shahnameh editing. So he edited Shahnameh and he believes that this is the version. In that version, he says, Makush muraki ra ke dane kesh ast. Makush. He says, don't kill the ant. The version that we have from Sa'di says, Mayoza, don't harm, don't hurt. But in this version says that don't kill, which makes more sense because Tur wants to kill Iraj. But then how these verse changed over the years is just another story that I don't have time to get into. So I move on. Anyway, so they kill Iraj. So, and that's a very sad part of the Shahnameh, but they are very beautiful, strong words. I encourage you to read it and just read it. It's very beautiful. Anyway, and at the end, after that, we have mourning of Feridun. Feridun cries over Iraj. One of the places in Shahnameh, many places in Shahnameh that we have this kind of mourning. I mentioned about Ferdowsi's son. When I told you the story of Ferdowsi, I told you that Ferdowsi loses his own son during his life. And he mourns over his own son. And I told you that he narrates these kind of mournings in Shahnameh a lot. Many fathers cry over their dead son. And this is one of the examples. Feridun does that. And he does it a lot. Actually, several pages of Shahnameh is dedicated to justice. Anyway, and then Manucher is born. Manucher is the grandson of Iraj. He's born and he's taken care of and raised by his great-grandfather, Feridun. And then he goes to war with Salman Tur and defeats them, and end of the story. So, and he becomes king at the end of this story where Feridun dies. So we have a couple of beautiful verses at the end of this story that Dr. Khalegi believes that this is just an addition to Shahnameh. This is not an actual verse from Ferdowsi. However, others have different opinion, including myself, because these two sentences, the verses are very strong. So it says, کرانه گزید از بر تاج و گاه. After Feridun gives the throne to Manucher, it says that کرانه گزید از بر تاج و گاه. He says that, okay, then he moved away from the throne and from the crown and from his reign. And he went to just one corner and lived there. کرانه گزید از بر تاج و گاه، نهاده بر خود سر هر سه شاه. This is the horrifying image that Ferdowsi depicts. This is that putting on his side the heads of the three sons. So all the three sons are killed and their head are chopped off. And all of them are sent to Feridun. The first one, Iraj's head, is sent to him by Salman II. And this is another very emotional image. It says that Feridun was there to see his son coming to him. And they said that, oh, somebody's coming. A horse is coming. And Feridun getting excited and excited to see his son. But then he sees someone else coming with a box. And inside that box, there is a head. And then later on, Manucher, when he goes to war with Salman II, he kills them one by one, chop off their heads, and then send them to his father. So Feridun has all the three heads. And says, کرانه گزید از بر تاج و گاه، نهاده بر خود سر هر سه شاه. The heads of the three kings are next to him. And this is the image that he creates with this verse at the end of the story. One thing I want to mention about this story, which is very interesting, so you want to get used to this kind of interpretation from Shahnameh. So the story of Feridun is obviously two parts. The first part, Feridun is born, fights Zahak, defeats Zahak, and chain him in the mountains. The second part is the story of Feridun sitting on the throne, becoming the king, doing all the good things, and with his three sons. And that is the story of the one son killed by the other two, and then the avenge after them. So these two stories, they are the story of the same person, Feridun. But if you look at it a bit more closely, you see that if the first part of the story was not there, the second part was instead of a valid story, right? The story is of a king with three sons, that fight between them, that unfortunate ending. It has nothing to do with Zahak. And if you look at the first story, you do not need the second part for it. Why? Because the origin of these two stories are completely different. And they're merged together in the narration of our myths according to Shahnameh, or Shahnameh of Abu Mansur, or some Khudainamas. But if you look at the origin, for example, I told you that we have Zahak and Feridun in Avesta, but we don't have the story of Feridun and his sons in Avesta. Obviously, this story is created in another time, another era. Some, like Dr. Zabiullah Safa, believe that, one of the scholars of Shahnameh, believes that this story is not older than the Parthian era. And his argument is that before the Parthians, we did not have any strong tribe in the eastern part of Iran. So this story did not make much sense, that saying that, okay, in the western part of Iran, eastern part of Iran, we have two brothers and two armies that come to war with Iran. We don't have that much background that people, that this story can be shaped. But we have that from the Parthian forward. We have the eastern tribes of Iran, so who come to war with Iranians a lot. And we have also in the western part, the Romans in the west. I don't know if I mentioned this, that even these three characters, these three sons, have three special characters And that those characters are the type of characters that Iranians believed that their neighbors had. So they believe that the people who are in the West, Babylonians, Egyptians, and Greeks, they are greedy. They are after riches, and they're wise people. And this is the character that we see from Salman, the older brother. He is the first person who becomes greedy, and he wants to get Iraj's portion. And he is not the one who kills him, but he triggers the other brother. And he is the person who notices that his army loves Iraj over him. When Iraj comes to see his brothers, the first thing that Sam observes is that the army, the soldiers, look at this guy, look at this younger brother, said, wow, what a gentleman. So he needs to be our king. He deserves to be the king. And he becomes worried. And he tells Tur, see, our problem was just his portion of the world before, but now we have another thing to worry about. That our soldiers do not want us anymore. They want him. And you need to get rid of him. This is the word that Sam tells his brother Tur. He says that you need to, you need to get rid of him. And that triggers him and leads into that unfortunate killing. He's the wise one. But Tur, on the other hand, is violent. He's short-sighted and he is uncontrollable. So these are the type of characters that Iranians believed that their Eastern neighbors had. So they were not as civilized as the Westerns. They were violent, they were wild, and they attacked them left and right. So even on the West, they basically had treaties, they had basically agreements, and they had peaceful times. But there was nobody to talk to in their East. So there were tribes who attacked Iranians at different times, and they had caused a lot of problems. Anyway, so this shows that this is the way that stories or myths are shaped, and this could be one of them. Anyway, let's go to the era of Manusher. Manusher, his name is Manushchitra. In Avesta, we have Manushchitra, who is a descendant of Thratona or Freydum. And in that story, Manucher, who kills Salman II. By the way, we do not have Salman II in Shahnameh, and we don't have Iraj. But we have, there are three countries, three areas, regions which are named in Avesta: Iriana, Toeriana, and Syriamiana. So very similar to Iraj, Salman II, Turasa. So these three regions or countries are mentioned in Avesta, and the regards is sent to the Fravahars of the good people of these lands. That's what we see from this. But one thing I always need to remind you is that we do not have the entire Avesta. Who knows? Maybe in the last parts of Avesta, this story was developed. Or the other thing I mentioned last time is that some of these stories are just mentioned. The whole story is not in Avesta. Avesta was not the place to tell those stories. But like, for example, in Gata, Yam, Ima, or Jamshid is mentioned, but just briefly mentioned for the sin that he did. But everybody knows or knew back then who Jamshid was. So Gata did not want to tell us the story. It wanted to give us advice based on the destiny of Jamshid. So this is the way that you need to look at it, especially the religious books. Some of them are like this. So they just need to mention something that everybody knows about. But that's why maybe we do not have more details about what who are these people. So what are these three lands? What's happening there? Where are they? So we do not have that. Anyway, at the time of Manucher, so we enter a new kind of new part of Shahnameh, which is the heroic part. Why? Because kind of at the end of the Feridun's story, when Manucher story starts, we see that a few names are mentioned, a few people who were not there before. Qaran, Sam, Yarshasp, and uh, Shidush, and a couple of other names are mentioned. These are the heroes of Iran, the commander, the army commanders. Up to this point in Shahnameh, you see the king does everything, and he is everything. But after that, from this moment forward, we see that these new type of characters emerge, and they play roles. We still do not have ordinary people. There are just a handful of ordinary people mentioned in Shahnameh, and one of them is the one that I skipped, Kaveh Ahangar, the blacksmith. And let me just briefly tell that the story of Kaveh is also not that old. Kaveh Ahangar, Kaveh the blacksmith, who goes to Zahak and then rebels against him, and with his whatever apron becomes the Rafshe Kavians, becomes that flag, which is actually a real flag. And in fact, people believe that Kaveh's name comes from that. The Rafshe Kavian comes from K, from Kianian, from kings. It means that the flag of the royal flag of Iran. But then they made the name Kaveh out of that. And they created this story of Kaveh around Kavian Dirafshi, which was a real flag, the royal flag of Iran. And this is one of the characters who's loved a lot, especially by the ordinary people. People who read Shahnameh, some of them said, "Oh, it's all about these noble people," even though they loved the stories and they had so much respect for these characters. But when it was about Kaveh, they said, "Oh, Kaveh is one of us," and Kaveh creates a revolution and changes things. So in different times in our history, some people even abused Kaveh for the purpose of their own ideology, because it basically was perfectly aligned with whatever they wanted. Anyway, Kaveh is one of the special characters, but Darash Kavian is real, is the flag of Iran, and which had a very sad ending. In the war between Iran and Arabs, Darash Kavian is captured by the Muslim army. And we know the character name, I don't remember the name, but that character gets that Darash Kavian and he sells it. He sells it, I think, for 30,000 dinars. And they say that at that point, it was maybe over 1 million dinars worth, but he just sold it for 30,000 coins to the commander of army, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. And then he gave it to the ruler, Omar. Omar was the Caliph back then. He gave it to him and he ordered it to be cut into pieces, small pieces, and distributed among the army of Islam. The same thing that they did to the famous rug of Baharistan, the beautiful large Baharistan rug, which was in the palace of the king. They cut that one also into the pieces, similar to what happened to the Berlin Wall. They did pretty much the same thing, which is pretty sad. Anyway, so let's get back to the story of Manucher. At this, as I mentioned, so this is the start of the heroic era. And in fact, the story of Manucher is all of a sudden the story of one of the famous heroes of Iran, Sam, and his family. The story of Sam, Zal, and Seymour, you know that story. I don't get into that. And then, so yeah, Sam has a white-haired son, Zal, that he takes him to the mountains, leave him there, abandon him there, and then Seymour raise him. And then he goes back to the palace, and he becomes a very knowledgeable and strong hero after that. And then we have the story of Zal and Rudabe. Rudabe, the daughter of Mehrab, and the two marry after a very beautiful, dramatic story in which we have strong characters like Rudabe and her mom Sindocht, who goes to Sam and have a conversation with him. I mentioned that before, I think. And then and also Zal himself, that goes to the palace and goes talk to the king, and king asks him questions, test him, both physically and mentally, or intellectually. And then at the end, he said, okay, I agree with this marriage. One of the things that I usually mention in this part of Shahnameh is that you need to know the stories of Shahnameh from the beginning, for some of the stories to make sense to you. You understand it more. In this part of the story, we know that Manucher is against this marriage. He doesn't want the two to marry. Why? He says because Mehrab, the father of Rudabe, is a descendant of Zahak, which is bad by itself. But why Manucher is so strongly against it? Because Manucher is the grandson of Feridun, who defeats Zahar. We should know that story for this story to make a bit more sense. So that's why we have this chain of stories. In this story, for example, this makes sense. Remember, I told you the story of the three sons that may not be that related, but in here, this story seems to be related to that story. So this connection is created for this story. Again, remember that all of these stories come from different times. The story of Zal and Rostam come from not even different time, from a different place, from a different route. The story of Rostam and his family come from Sakaha. So who were the tribe from the eastern part of Iran. These are the stories that they come from them. And some even believe that Ferdowsi got the story of Rostam and his family from a different source. So there was a book of Azad Sarv. There was a character named Azad Sarv. And this gentleman lived in Marv. Ferdowsi mentions that. At the time of Rostam's death, in the introduction of that story, Ferdowsi mentions that Azad Sarv had a book, and I'm narrating this story from Azad Sarv. And he says that Azad Sarv had a lot of stories about Rostam. So some, including Dr. Khalaqi, believe that the stories of Rostam come from that root, from that book, and they are added to Shahnameh. Remember, I told you that in Avesta, we do not have Rostam. We have Krasaspa. We have Garshasp. That is the main character, the main hero. But all of a sudden, when we reach Shahnameh, we see that Garshasp disappears, and then Rostam is a strong replacement here. So this is why either Ferdowsi used his book for these stories, or the authors of Shahnameh, Abu Mansur, did that. They merged the story of Khodainames and the story of Azad Sarv, and maybe some other sources. Remember, the job of those mubads, those four mubads that were hired by Abu Mansur, was to collect the stories of Iran's past. And they had Khodainames as the main reference, but maybe they took some other books as well. We know that some of the stories of Shahnameh, we know where the source was. For example, the story of Alexander Iskandar, we know that they all come, or mostly come from one novel called Alexander's novel. It's named as Iskandar Name, or Roman Iskandar. Iskandar's novel that was originally in Greek. It was written in Egypt. And then it had translations into various languages, and eventually it appeared in Shahnameh, Shahnameh of Abu Mansur or Shahnameh of Ferdowsi. We don't know. So mostly we believe that Ferdowsi just narrated whatever was in Shahnameh of Abu Mansur. So if that's the case, that story somehow entered into the story of Shahnameh of Abu Mansur. And this is one of those things that many believe that this was a wrong choice, because Alexander Iskandar is completely different character than what we think he was. He was basically was an attacker. He was a person who Iskandar Gojastak, it's called, Zoroastrians name it as such, even though the root of that concept, why as Iskandar is Gojastak, is yet another story that I don't have time to get into. However, we know that at least in the Sasanian era, there was no good view of Alexander. But in the story of Shahnameh, Alexander is pretty good. He's an explorer. Even though he defeats Dara, who they believe that is Darius III, this is the part of Shahnameh I mentioned that the history and myths basically converge. And after that, we have Sasanians who are actually real kings. However, even in Shahnameh, we know that Iskandar did not even kill Dara. And at the end, he mourns over his body. He says, I did not want him killed. But there are two viziers of Dara who kill him, because they think that if they kill him, that they take the body to Alexander, they will get prize. They will even given some lands, which does not happen, and Alexander punishes them and kills them. But this is the way that the story comes here. And also the connection between Alexander and Dara, Iskandar and Dara, that one is also very interesting. So again, I'm jumping back and forth because there are things that I definitely want to mention, and there are some points I want to make. This is one of those parts. The story of Dara and Iskandar is in a way that the father of Dara, Darab, first marries a girl from the Roman Empire. So the daughter of Phoedrus, who's the Caesar of Rome. And that girl is named Nahid. And one night, Nahid's mouth has some bad smell. And Dara does not like that. And he asks the physicians to come and fix her bad smell. And they do that using a plant named Iskandar. The name of Iskandar comes from that plant, according to Shahnameh. And then it fixes the bad smell. Everything's good. However, Darab does not like her anymore after this, and then returns her back to Rome, to her father. And that girl, Nahid, at that point is pregnant. And the boy that is born from her is Iskandar. And then Darab marries another girl, and then they have a son named Dara. And Dara becomes the king after Darab. And then Iskandar comes to Iran, and they have that war, which also has a story that I skip. And at the end, Iskandar defeats Dara. Dara gets killed, as I mentioned, and then Iskandar captures her. So in that story, Iskandar is half Iranian, which is completely nonsense. And if he captures Iran, he is Iranian. Come on, we did not get defeated by a foreigner. He was Iranian. We made him Iranian to feel good, right? So, and this is the part of the story that we do not even have in any other source. I told you about Alexander Novel that has all these other stories that we see from Iskandar in Shahnameh. The story of Iskandar, Alexander the explorer, who goes to different lands and has different experiences, including I told you that what the story of Brahmans. He goes to the land of Brahmans and has that conversation with those. This is one example. But there are some weird things, that weird stories that you see. He see creatures of different types. Some of them have big ears, some of them are black and small, and very weird stories. And they're nonsense, but they are Shahnameh because of that source. And Ferdowsi believed that he needs to follow whatever his source says and convert them into poetry. And he does that. And at the end, I mentioned last time that he said, finally, I passed the dam of Alexander. It's just the obstacle of Iskandar. I'm passing that finally. He does not like it, but he has to do it. And he does it. So this is the story of Alexander. I'm glad that I covered this part. Let's get back to the story of Zal and Rudabe. I want to finish that story by mentioning. Okay, I told you about this. Yeah, this is why I said that. I said that some of the sources of Shahnameh, we already know what they are, and that's why I told you the story of Alexander. So we know where that comes from. Or a story of Ardeshir Babakan comes from a book called Karnamak Ardeshir Papakan. Which is basically Karnamak means transcript, or it's just basically the story of Ardeshir Babakan. We have that book, which the story in there is very similar to the story of Yav in Shahnameh. Or the story of Shatranj, right? Chess. We talked about it as well, chess and Nard and backgammon. That story we also know is from another book, which is the story of Shatranj. So that book also is there. Or I told you about the part of Shahnameh about Daghiri, that is by Daghiri, and that is the story of Zartosht and the war between Iran and Turan. So we have this book. We have Yadegar Zariran. So we have that, which is a book that originally is from the Parthian era. This is the first first heroic story of Iran. This is the first epic story that we have, and at this and now they believe that it wasn't even in poetry. That's from the Parthian era. Yadegar Zariran. And that story is very similar to what we have in Shahnameh. So we have other sources that we already know where the stories of Shahnameh come from them. Right? So that's why I'm saying that the stories of Rostam and his family also come from the sources from the Sakaha, from the east. And that has replaced the story of So Faribors, I do not see you. There you are. So now is the time of the Arash. I want to talk to you about Arash. So the story of Zal and Rudabe is at the time of Manucher. Manucher, and one thing to remember is that even though the entire story of Manucher's reign is about Sam, Zal, and Rostam, who are the heroes, is not about the king. However, king has a role in it. And this is important. At the end of the day, this is Shahnameh. And all these stories are somewhat related to the king. Otherwise, this hero might have done something on his own that's nothing to do with anything. We do not have those stories. Remember, I told you that there are a lot of stories in our mythology, and a lot of stories in our ancient texts. And some of them were oral, some of them were written. But not all of them are in Shahnameh. I told you that we have many other names, right? Those narrate some other parts of our story. However, the parts that are basically work well, and they are basically helping to create this consistent and connected chain of stories are in Shahnameh, but some are not. One of them is the story of Arash. So the story of Manucher, the time of Manucher is a time of peace. According to Shahnameh, when Manucher dies, before on his deathbed, he talks to his son Nozar, and he tells him that, remember, something's going bad is going to happen at your time. And Turanian, which is the first time that we hear about them after Tur is killed. Now we hear about Turanian, which is the descendants of Tur. And they said that, okay, the king of Turan, which is now a region, is going to come to war with you. And in that case, remember to get help from Sam and Zal and his newborn son, which is Rostam. I did not mention the story of Rostam's birth. So, but just let me show you this that I told you last time. So this is the fourth book of the children that is just published. I just have one copy that I got myself from Amazon. Anyway, so that is, I tell that story in the book, but obviously the better version is Shahnameh itself. So you can read that. You do not need my book. But that is also a beautiful story, the story of Seymour coming to help, and you know that story. So let me just skip that. So, but he says that go get help from them, and this is exactly what happens. So Nozar, when he comes to power, unfortunately he forgets all the good advice given by his father, and he becomes a bad king. He just does all the harms to people, and that's why people don't like him, and that's why he loses Far or Farah. Remember I talked about that? He loses that, and he becomes vulnerable, and Hashang, the king of Turan, comes to war with him, and he does not come himself. He sends his own son, Afrasiab. And this is the first time that we hear about Afrasiab. Afrasiab comes to war, and he is the winner of this war. Nozar gets captured first and then killed. Nozar, the king of Iran, gets killed. This is the first time that we see, besides Zahak, who we do not consider as part of this group, is the first king that gets killed. And then another person who gets killed is his brother, Afrasiab's brother, the son of Pashang, the king of Turan, named Aghliras. He's a very good character. He's a wise person, and he's very benevolent. He's very positive character, and he gives good advice to Afrasiab, but unfortunately Afrasiab does not listen to him. And at the end, Afrasiab kills his own brother. Again, history repeats itself. Tur kills Iraj, and Afrasiab kills Aghliras. Again, brother. And so one thing to also highlight about Shahnameh in general is that there is a very common and prevalent theme in Shahnameh, and as the theme of revenge. So it starts from the first story, the story of Kumars, and then Siamak, his son, who gets killed. And after that, Kumars doesn't know what to do. He just sits and cries for a year until Soroush comes and says that, why are you sitting here? Go take a revenge. And he said, oh, okay, that's a good idea. And then he says, okay, I'm too old. And he asks his grandson, the son of Siamak, which is Kupshang, to go to take the revenge. We have that story I mentioned. This is the first revenge. So the term revenge in Shahnameh is called Khun Khahi. Khun means blood. It means blood seeking blood. Right? So we have that one is the first one, but the one that is, and Feridun does that again, right, from Zahak, because Zahak has killed his father. Feridun does that, even though he does not kill Zahak, but still defeats him. And after that, we have the story of Manucher doing the blood seeking, Khun Khahi, of Iraj. And in the story of Nozar, we see that, okay, the war between Iran and Turan, the excuse for that is that Manucher has killed Tur. Has killed Iraj. Manucher has killed Tur. Now Afrasiab comes and killed Nozar. And then another war that they want to avenge Nozar. And it just keeps going and going on and on and on until we reach a point that yet another tragedy happens. That's the tragedy of Siavash. That's where Afrasiab kills Siavash, the prince, the son of Kekavus. And then we have another long round of wars to avenge Siavash. So this is a very common theme that happens in Shahnameh. So I want to mention that as well. And I wanted to say that for another reason, which I now do not remember. So anyway, so Nozar, now I remember why I want to say that. I wanted to mention this, that when Khosrow captures Afrasiab eventually at the end, and he kills them. Before that, he says that I'm taking the revenge of 3 people from you. One is Nozar. One is obviously Siavash, right? Khosrow is the son of Siavash that eventually takes the revenge. Says that this year, I'm here to do kin khahi or khun khahi of my father, Siavash, Nozar, the king of Iran, and Agridas. The third person is the brother of Afrasiab, who's a good person, even though he's not Iranian. He says that, okay, you did bad to Agridas, to your own brother. He mentioned that too. Okay, so the reason I'm talking about Nozar and then I want to talk about Zaf Tahmas is because I want to come back to the story of Arash as after this. So after Nozar is dead, so obviously the Iranians want to take revenge and they want to recapture the land, and Zal has a main role. This is the only place that we see Zal as a hero in the story of Nozar. Zal plays that role. After that, after Nozar's time, when is at the time of Zaf Tahmas. Zaf Tahmas is an old person who they bring to the throne because he's a descendant of Feridun. Remember that always the Iranian king needs to be a descendant of another king. So he comes to the power, becomes the king, and at his time, there's a war, but it's not a serious war. And at the end, they sign a treaty, and then the war is over, and everything's back to normal. Why? Because there's drought, and the two soldiers of the two sides are pretty frustrated, and they say that, okay, we have brought this to us. This drought is because we are bad, because we are fighting. Just let's get over that and just finish that war. And they do that, and once they do that, then there's rain and everything comes back to green and everything's good. And then after 5 years, Zaf Tahmas, Zaf dies. So, and then after that, when now they want to have another king, that's the time that Zal, they come to Zal, say that, okay, tell us what to do. And Zal said, oh, I'm too old. I cannot do this. So Zal becomes old pretty fast, but then stays old forever. As I mentioned last time, he never dies. But just during that short period, Zal is the main hero of Iran. But at that time, he says that I'm old and Rostam is my replacement. This is the place that Rostam enters the picture. However, I want to stop here and tell you about these 3 kings that I told you about: Manucher, Nozar, and Zaf. If you look at these 3 together, Manucher is the king that Iran is at peace. There's no war at this time. During Nozar's time, we have that war. Nozar gets killed, and then Zaf Tahmas becomes a replacement, and there is a peace at the end of Zaf Tahmas. This is according to Shahnameh. However, there is a very important character in our mythology, and that is called Arash. We have Arash in Avesta, Eraksha, Arash of Shabatir. Shabatir, which is translated into to Kamangir, Arash the archer. And you might have heard the story of Arash. Who has heard the story of Arash? Raise your hands. Okay, not everybody, actually. I'm surprised. I thought that you all know, because it's very, very famous story. Arash is the person who actually finishes a war between Iran and Turan. How? According to Avestan and according to other sources, Iran and Turan are at war. And then Iranians are basically are to be defeated. So the Turanian army is prevailing. And then Iranians find a solution to end the war and just survive. They said, okay, let us do this. Let us bring a person, an archer, who shoot an arrow from that location that this army is basically surrounded, which is in Mazandaran, is the northern part of Iran. Hatashkhargar, according to Avesta, this is that area. So they are surrounding that area. It said that, okay, we find somebody who goes to the Mount Alborz, or actually Mount Ruyan, which is one of the hills, one of the peaks of Alborz. Yes. Go up on top of that mountain, and then he shoots an arrow to the east. And wherever that arrow lands, that becomes the border of Iran and Turan. And the king of Turan, who's Afrasiab, says, oh, sure, let's do it. So how many feet or how many meters is he going to shoot? He accepts that. And then they find Arash. Arash is a blessed person, is a person that is blessed by Sepandar Mas, in fact. And he comes and he becomes naked in front of the army and says, look at me. I'm a healthy person. I have a healthy body. I'm going to shoot this arrow and my body is going to be disintegrated as a result of this. And I'm going to die, but I'm going to die for Iran. And I'm going to put all my power into this arrow and I'm going to shoot it. So he goes on top of that peak and then shoots. And shoots so far away. تیر آرش را سوارانی که میراندند در جیحون به دیگر نیم روزی از پی آن روز نشسته بر تناور ساق گردویی فرو دیدند و از آنجا را از آن پس مرز ایران شهر و توران بازنامیدند. It says the horsemen who were following the arrow, they rode for a day to finally see that arrow in a big walnut tree at the coast of the Ox River, Jehun. Abu Darya is called Abu Darya today. Jehun that river becomes the border of Iran and Turan. This poem that I briefly read for you, believe it or not, is a contemporary poem. It's not from Shahnameh. It's from a poet named Siyavush Asrai, who lived up to a few decades ago. He basically narrated this story based on what we have in Avestan. He turned that into poetry. This is basically the most famous contemporary epic poem of Iran. It's a very good one. He tells that story. And that's why now I should say that I'm not surprised that you have not heard it, because the Iranians mostly heard that story of Arash because of him, because of that very recent poem, not because of the sources. Even though the name Arash has been, people named their sons Arash, and they just knew that story briefly, but it was not that common. So anyway, so the story of Arash is in our sources, but is completely missing from Shahnameh. And that's a very big question for many people, including Fariborz. Why is it not in Shahnameh? So I told you that the king of Iran makes that suggestion to Afrasiab. Afrasiab is the king or the commander of the Turanian army. Who is the king of Iran, according to that story? It's Manucher. But wait a minute. According to Shahnameh, there is no war at the time of Manusher. The war started at the time of Nozar. But according to Avesta, Nozar never becomes king. Nozar gets killed in the war between Iran and Turan at the time of his father Manusher. Nozar does not become king. But the Shahnameh's story is different. Because the story of Manusher is the story of Zal and Sam and Rostam. It's a happy ending, the story of Rostam's birth. And there is no place for that war. So that war is moved into the time of Nozar. And Nozar gets killed. So obviously that story cannot be the story of Arash ending the war in that way. So the end of the war moves into the next king, Zav Tahmas. And at that time, when, according to Shahnameh, they decide to end the war, and the war is ended. How? It mentions that the Turanians returned back to their own borders. But what border? From this moment on in Shahnameh, it always talks about Jehun, that river, to be the border of Iran and Turan. But it never mentions that before. At the time of Feridun, it does not say exactly where Turan is. But after this point, we always know. Obviously, because of Arash, because of all that happened to him. But we do not see why. Again, this is another example that if we want to just complete the picture, we need to know the other sources. And also the other interesting is that we see that there is drought, and the drought ends when the war ends. This also has some relationship to Arash. The story of Arash in Avesta is in the Tishtar Yasht. What is Tishtar? Tishtar is the rain star. So the story of Arash is in Tishtar Yasht. Why Tishtar? Tishtar is, Tishtar is the star of rain, the symbol of rain, and green, and basically all the good things in the world. But also, Tishtar is translated as Tir. Tir and Tishtar are the same thing. Tir is arrow. So Tirgan is the celebration, one of those famous festivals that we have, right? Which was, I think, a month ago. And in Tirgan, that is a celebration of water. Even Abrizan, people just throw water at each other, right? So, but also it's the story of Arash. They believe that Tirgan is the day that Arash shoot that arrow. So these two are somewhat connected. And that's why the drought is ending, because of Teshtar, because of Tir. But Ferdosi didn't have any place to put this story in. It might not have been Ferdosi. Again, it might have been the source of him. So we already know, I mentioned that a million times. So it might have been Shahnameh, Abu Mansur, or Khodai Namas, who knows. But the other story is not obviously Shahnameh. But to basically just completely baffle your mind and just blow your mind, maybe, I tell you that we have Arashi Shahnameh. Where? Arash is referenced in Shahnameh in several places after the story of Manusher and Nozar, without even mentioning who the hell Arash was. But we know it talks about it. So we have the story of Arash, especially in one location. So one place that we have, by the way, is that it's mentioned that Ashkanian, our Saisids, Parthians, those are the descendants of Arash. It mentions that. When Ashkanian is finished and is right before Sasanian, Ferdowsi says, okay, so they all died after Ardaban the fifth, who was defeated by Ardashi Babakon. He says that all of them were all of the descendants of Arash disappear. So according to Shahnameh, Ashkanian are the descendants of Arash. However, there is a very interesting part of Shahnameh that talks about Arash in details. And that's the story of Bahram Chubin. Bahram Chubin, I mentioned that before, was a commander of the Iranian army at the time of Hormuz. Hormuz, I think the fourth, who was the son of Anushirvan, Khosrow Anushirvan. At the time, there was a war between Iran and China. And in that war, they have Bahram Chubin as the Iranian commander who goes and defeats the Chinese and save Iran. However, Hormuz does not treat him well. And I set that story aside. But that is the reason that Bahram Chubin gets angry and he decides to rebel against the Iranian king. And that's the main story of Hormuz and his son Khosrow Parviz in Shahnameh, which I mentioned last time. This is a pretty long story. All the stories of these fights and wars back and forth between these folks, between Bahram Chubin and Hormuz first, and then Khosrow Parviz. At the time of Khosrow Parviz, there is a conversation between Khosrow Parviz, the king of Iran, and Bahram Chubin. And this conversation is related to Arash because Bahram Chubin says that I have to be the king of Iran because I'm a descendant of Arash. Again, it mentions Arash without saying who Arash was. But this part is even more interesting when we look at this conversation. Khosrow Parviz tells Bahram, you're telling me that you're a descendant of Arash. Let me ask you this. Who was the king at the time of Arash? And surprisingly, Arash says Manuche. What? We don't see that in Shahnameh. But it mentions that at the time of Khosrow Parviz, we see this in Shahnameh. It says that Manucher was the king at the time of Arash. So it gets back to that original story. The story of Arash ending the war between Manucher's army and Afrasiab. So that's what we have in other sources, but not in Shahnameh. So nobody asks, wait a minute. So at the time of Manucher, we do not have any war. Where was that war? But anyway, it says that Manucher was the king. There you go. Manucher was the king. And Arash was his servant. Arash was his soldier. And he obeyed the rules of Manucher. And you are my commander. You are my soldier. You need to follow my order. You're telling me that Manucher was the king, not Arash. So this is an interesting conversation between the two. But that also reveals the fact that we have different stories that some of them enter our Shahnameh, some of them are not. And so I have a lot more to talk about, but I don't have time, but I just want to at least cover this part. And that I briefly mentioned last time when I told you the story of all these long ages, long lives that these different characters have, 500 years, 700 years. And I told you because there are a lot of stories about them. And then if you put them together and you want to just show that, for example, Rostam has a story with Keykabuz, with Keykhosrow, with Goshtas, then we have to make Rostam a long living person. We have to. But what we need to get used to is that different stories of Shahnameh come from different layers of myths. Some of them they are created at different times. I gave you one example about the story of Feridun and Zahak, and then Feridun and his sons. They come completely different times, but they're bound together and become a connected story, even though they were not. Let me give you two more examples. One of them is about Mount Alborz. This is one of the baffling parts of Shahnameh. Where is Alborz? Alborz today is a mountain in the northern part of Iran. But when you read Shahnameh, there are references where we can say for sure that this Alborz is not that Alborz. Faranak, when she wants to escape from Iran, from Zahak, takes her son and takes her to Mount Alborz in India. What? Alborz in India? Yeah. Alborz in the eastern part of Iran. Alborz is a mythological mountain. We have Alborz in Avesta. It's called Harabeyzeiti. It's the name of Alborz. And it's believed that it was the first mountain in the world. The first one that was sprouted, and it was all around the world. So then Alborz could have been anywhere, technically, because it's around the world. Now we have this in the story of Rostam and the white demon, the 7 labors of Rostam I mentioned. In that time, Keykavus and his army are captured in Mount Alborz. Actually, let me just correct that. So it does not mention necessarily the Alborz, if I'm not mistaken, but it's saying that it's on the way to Mazandaran. And Mazandaran today is in the northern part of Iran, and Alborz is there. However, even that Mazandaran may not be that Mazandaran, the one that we have today. Some believe that Mazandaran was also in the east. So this is why these stories come from different times, and these names come from different times. Then I'll give you another one that is very close to your heart. We all know about the Lake Chichast, right? According to Avesta, Zarathustra is born on the side of the Lake Chichast. Chichast Lake. Daryay Chichast. Where is that lake? So we know today, so this is what I've seen that many scholars believe, that Zarathustra was from the eastern part of Iran, right? The main reason for that comes from the language of Avesta, language of Gata. That's an Eastern language. So that's one of the very few, basically, sources to work with, right? So we do not have much to reason with, but we know the language that is an Eastern language. So this is one of the main reasons that they believe that Zarathustra comes from the East. However, when I even remember when I was a kid, I read that in our books that Zarathustra comes from the West, from Azerbaijan. And many people believe that even today. And the reason is that, for example, they say that it was called next to Daryay Chichast, the Chichast Lake, which is, they believe that is Urumie. There is a lake, famous lake. It was one of the, I think it's the biggest internal lake of Iran in the northwestern part of Iran. But they say that what happened was that there were some Zoroastrian Mubads at the Medes era, Medes before Achaemenid. At that time, they migrated to that region and they named that lake Chichast. They named it as such, and then moving forward, other people actually, yeah, that was Chichast. But no, they just named it as such. It's the same story at Alborz. The Mount Alborz in the northern part of Iran was named at some point Alborz. It was the most important. Alborz is the tallest mountain in Iran. So at some point they named it Alborz because they had that name in their history. Like, for example, if today we name our son Zarathustra or Jahamas or Gushtas, that doesn't mean that these the Gushtas or these Zarathustra. No, we just named it as such. So these are the things that people get confused by when they look at Shahnameh, when they look at our religious books. We need to know that these names or these references were different things at different times. And some of these stories which are attached to each other, there are thousands of years apart. And that's where you get confused. And it's interesting that all these confusions in Shahnameh are not explained. Either people knew or accepted it. However, at the later years, I want to just mention this as well to you. You might have heard about Naqqals. Naqqals were the narrators of Shahnameh. People who narrated the stories of Shahnameh for common people. in the coffee houses. They narrated those stories. They played those stories, and the story of those Naqals are pretty interesting as well. So I do not have time to talk about it. But I just mentioned that Naqals were telling these stories to common people, and then they even invented some stories and added the stories on their own to Shahnameh and told them to regular people. And one of the things that they did at their job was to clarify things that were unclear from Shahnameh's text. Things that were not explained, they created explanation on their own, just so people do not have these kind of questions. You just, when you read Shahnameh, you have a zillion questions. Why this? Why that? What happened here? What happened there? Because Shahnameh comes from our mythological sources, and from the places where all of these are not answered. Some of them do not have answers. Some of them are briefed for some reasons. But Naqals, they had this role of explaining this to people. So they created their own stories. The story of Kaveh Ahangar. Kaveh, with the apron, putting that on the stick and making that a flag, Kaviani flag. The story of Kaveh in Shahnameh is just about 10, I don't know, maybe 50 lines, let's say. But they have lots of stories around Kaveh, where he came from, what he did first, what are where did their sons and people who came to his shop, and then he went and do that, and then he talked to Fereydun, and he talked to some imaginary holy people. A lot of stories that they invented on their own, just to explain things, to make it interesting, to make it exciting. Just as you can tell you this much, that these guys were so interesting characters that sometimes even changed the ending of the story because people did not like some endings. They were fights in coffee houses because people did not want Naqal to kill Sohrab. Seriously, they were threatened. You do not dare killing Sohrab this time. So yeah, anyway, so it's 1:43 hours. So I want to wrap things up. Let me just see what other highlights I want to give you very briefly. I know that you have also questions, but let me just see what else I wanted to mention. I talked about yeah, I completely skipped the whole Rostam story, so I did not go too much into the story of Rostam. But as I mentioned, Rostam's stories are not that old. They come from completely different sources, which are the Eastern stories of Sakaha, that who were actually Iranian tribes, that were not foreigners. But lots of those stories from Rostam, and only a few of them are in Shahnameh, by the way. There are a lot of other stories from Rostam that are not in Shahnameh. They are in other sources. But you said the story of Siavash. That's a very important story, especially because of Kehosru that comes after him. And Kehosru, you know, that is the holiest character of Shahnameh. And at the end, he even just goes into heaven. He disappears. He disappears along with several of the heroes of Shahnameh that apparently the storytellers did not have anything to do with them anymore. They got rid of him as they disappeared in the snow with Kehosru. But obviously Rostam remained because he was the character who wanted to play a role in the story of Goshtas. We do not see any heroic thing from Rostam anymore, but we see his death, his fight with Esfandiar, and then his death. And we know why he died right after killing Esfandiar. Esfandiar was blessed. I told you that Esfandiar was blessed by Zartosht. And this is what Seymour tells Rostam. Seymour shows Rostam how to kill. How? By shooting an arrow to his eyes. Why eyes? Because this story is not in Shahnameh. But we know, as I mentioned, Esfandiar was washed in the holy water. And obviously when a baby is washed in the water, his eyes are closed. The Achilles heel in Shahnameh is Esfandiar's eyes. right? He's not explaining Shahnameh, but we know that Seymour tells him. But Seymour mentions that if you kill him, you get killed. Whoever harms Svandiar is going to be killed in a very horrific way. It mentions that because we know that Svandiar is blessed person, and also Svandiar is the person who's promoting Zoroastrianism. So he's blessed by God or Zarathustra. And this is why what happens to Rostam right after he gets killed. And then after that, we have the story of Bahman, and Bahman takes revenge again, but in a very sad and cruel way. He takes revenge from Zal, the father of Rostam. Rostam is already dead. But and Bahman, by the way, is raised by Rostam to follow what Isfandiar asked him before he dies. But Bahman takes a revenge from Zal, Rostam's father, and then from Faramaz. He just captures Zal and tortures him. He does not kill him, but he kills his son Faramaz. And then after that, as Pashutan begs him to let Zal go and just get back to capital because he was in Zabul. He gets back to capital, and then the story finishes this way. And then here we see references to another name. Bahman is called Ardeshir all of a sudden. Bahman Ardeshir. Ardeshir is the title of Bahman. But why Ardeshir? Because we know who this Ardeshir is. Is Ardeshir the first, the Achaemenid king? Is not just because of the name that we know, also because of a reference in one verse of Shahnameh that says that he had long hands, long arms. And this is exactly the title of Ardeshir I. Ardeshir I is called Ardeshir Derazdast, long-armed Ardeshir. Why long arm? Not because he had actually long arms. It was because they said that he had such a large territory from east to west that it was like, for example, he had very long arms that had all of these to him. But with just in the common stories, it turns into becoming the literal. And Shahnameh is also literal. So that he had long hair. So he was Ardeshir I. This is the way that these two stories are merged. The story of Bahman and Ardeshir I. And why Ardeshir and not Cyrus the Great or Darius the Great? Ardeshir was pretty famous back then. These two were not. They were older kings, and there were not much stories about them. But Ardeshir I, for some reason, had a lot of stories. And that's why he appeared in our Shahnameh as well. And then we have the story of Homai, his daughter, who becomes the first woman king. And then Darab, her son, and his son. It's just a bit weird. Bahman marries his own daughter. So Darab is the son of both Homai and Bahman. We do not have these characters in the history. We do not have Homai, and we do not have Darab. Darab might be one of those Darius, maybe Darius II or something. However, we have Darab, Dara, the son of Dara, which I told you the story, and the war with Alexander Skanda. And that's where we get to the historical part. And the historical part is the story of Sasanian dynasty, not the Ashkanian, not the Parthians. Why? I briefly mentioned before, because Sasanians did not want to narrate the story of Parthians. According to Shahnameh, Parthians were the descendants of Alexander, not as blood descendants, but they were put in power by Alexander. But that's not the case. That's not true. Alexander's descendants were Seleucids, who ruled Iran for about 80 years, I guess. And after that, Parthians fought them, defeated them, and captured the land piece by piece. And at the end, they become a unified territory and became a very powerful empire. But according to Shahnameh, they call it Mulukut Tawayef. It means that the rulers of the tribes. It says that Alexander, this is according to Shahnameh, said that Alexander did not want a powerful Iran. So what he did is that he divided Iran into smaller pieces and puts one ruler on each one of these regions. That's why they call it Mulukut Tawayef, the rulers of tribes. And then he says that, Ashkanian parties were finished. They were defeated by one of those tribes, which is Ardavan the fifth, was defeated by Ardashir, and then Ardashir captured the other parts. And it was the end of Mulukut Tawayef. It was the end of the rulers of the regions. However, that's not true. Ardavan was the king of the whole land. And Mulukut Tawayef was the beginning. Yes, it was in the beginning of the party. They just had one area. But eventually they were all united in one part of this kingdom who ruled for almost 500 years. But Sasanians completely erased that. Remember that Khudainames were kind of the propaganda machine for Sasanian as it goes into the Sasanian era. And that's one of the things that we see very common in the Sasanian part of Shahnameh, that they talk about all the different policies, all the different basically renovations that they did, all the renewals that they, all the new rules and laws, and then all the lands and all the captures and all the victories. They talk about all of these. It's funny that there are a few kings in Shahnameh in the Sasanian era, which are obviously very powerful kings, and they have a lot of stories around them. So after Ardashir, we have Shapur the first, who defeats the Romans. We have Shapur the second. We have Bahram Gur. We have a lot of stories about Bahram Gur that come from different sources. Bahram Gur was an interesting character. Bahram Gur was one of those legends, and people was a dream king in people's opinions, and that's why you even see that in the literature. Said that, I think I don't remember what was the whole verse, but one of the poets says that, okay, everything was good as it was at the time of Bahram Gur. Like, for example, Bahram Gur was the time of happiness. Everybody was happy. And Bahram Gur is also very similar to Alexander. We have a lot of stories about him exploring things and doing things. And the characteristic of these type of rulers and the stories is that they are episodic. So there are smaller stories that we have from this king, instead of having one big coherent story as we do in the heroic part of Shahnameh, which is, for example, the story of Siavash, even though it's pretty long, is one story. And it starts from one point, and all of the things that happen after that, they're all connected, and they all make sense together. But the story of Alexander is just the story of going here, him here, seeing something, going somewhere else, see something else. They are not even connected. They're different stories. We have similar things in the time of Bahram Gur. Even in Anushirvan, more or less, we have similar pattern. But anyway, some of these stories of some of these kings are pretty long, and some of them are very small. Why? Because these kings were defeated by Romans. They did not want even to mention that. So apparently, but anyway, so Ferdowsi did not have obviously much stories from them. So some of the kings, when you look at their part in Shahnameh, is all about just giving advice. The king usually give advice in the beginning when he started sitting on the throne. He gives some advice, and then after that, is some of the kings, these stories have only one line or two lines. So that, oh, he was a good king, and he dies. And then at the time of death, he gives a lot of advice to their sons, the next kings. So this is the theme of many parts of Shahnameh in the Sasanian era. We have smaller stories, episodic stories, like for example, the story of chess. Has nothing to do with anything else before or after. It's just one story, tells the story of Shatranj, the chess. And then it moves to, for example, the story of Anushirvan and Shoemaker. This is yet another story. So the main story in the Sasanian era, which is coherent and is very similar to the story of the heroic part, is the story of Bahram Shubin, as I mentioned. the commander of Hormuz and Khosrow Parviz, and that story is completely connected, and it's also, I think, is the most exciting part of it, the historic part of Shahnameh. It's a fascinating story. I really love it, which is very similar to the heroic part. But some other kings, we don't have any story or much story on them. We have long story of Anushirwan, and in that story you hear about all of the good things that Anushirwan did. So obviously the Sasanian Khodainameh, want to say that Khodainameh started at the time of Anushirwan. So Anushirwan was the just king, even though I think it would have. So most probably he was a good king, but maybe not as good as it was written in that book. But anyway, Ferdowsi just narrated those stories. And then we have Khosrow Parviz, and Khosrow Parviz is the last powerful king. After him, there is no other king. There are maybe 5 or more kings right after him that are they have a short period of reign. They all kill each other, and it's just a mess until we see here. We reach the reign of Yazgir the third, and this fight between Iranians and Arabs, and you know that story, and that's the end of Shahnameh. At the end of Shahnameh, Ferdowsi talks about a few people, appreciates those who help him, including the tax collector of the area of Tus I mentioned, and the person who narrates the story and the person who transcribes his stories. So he Boudalaf, he mentioned that Ali Boudalaf and Ali Deylam and Boudalaf, these 2 characters, he mentioned them and thanked them. And then he mentioned the dates of the ending of Shahnameh, which I told you that is just that's Mah Sepandarmaz Ruze Erd or Erd from Sepandarmaz from Esfand. He mentioned that and then finishes it with one sentence: in the name of God. I finished the book in the name of God. He starts with the name of God and he finishes with the name of God. God is present in the entire book. God, the wisdom, the wise God, Kherat. It always talks about that, remember. So this is the end of our sessions. So I know that I left a lot of things unsaid. I didn't have time for it. Sorry about that. So yeah, almost 2 hours. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be happy to hear from you. I'm going to have a couple of questions from you as a quiz here, and then I'm going to also have a project for you that I was asked to give. So, and I'm going to basically grade them for you. So about the quiz. So why do we have, so let me first ask this question. Where is Alborz?
Mythology.
It's everywhere
Everywhere.
Why everywhere?
because it was the first mountain that propped up and it was all around the world.
Yeah. So in the story of Fereydun, where is that located, according to Shahnameh?
The east of Iran.
East of Iran and India. Mentioned this, is even mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
And so basically Pharaoh goes from Iran and lives in India for a while until basically they return to Iran. So, okay, that's one question. So the other question, so why don't we have the story of Arash in Shahnameh?
Don't know. It's a big mystery.
It is a big mystery, yes, but we can speculate. So what are some of the speculations? Freddie?
It's from a different source. The story of Arash is obtained from various sources, but in Shahnameh, it's just is mentioned during the time of Zav, King Zav, and
Who? Oh, Zab. Okay.
right.
No. So according to the source, is that the time of Manucher. Arash, according to Avesta and other sources, is at the time of Manucher.
Right. But when you know that Manu's chair time, it was all peace, so there was no fighting.
Exactly. There was no place for it.
Right.
So there was no war. It was the story of Zod and Rostam at the time of Manush. We could not fit that in there. There was no war, and at the time of Nozar also, it could not fit it because according to the source, we know that Nozar was killed, even though he was not even king. But when he became king at the time, Shahnameh gets killed. Arash cannot end the war at that moment. And then at the time of Zav, some actually, even in some sources, they actually mentioned that Arash was at the time of Zav. And one interesting thing about all of these myths, which are all over the place, all of these stories, there are different sources that even mention some crazy things. Like, for example, Arash kills Afrasiab. This is one story. The other source says that even Zav shoot the arrow. So it's so messed up. So all over the place. But at least we know that most probably it did not exist in Shahnameh because it did not have any place for it, and it was not in Ferdusi's source. One other speculation that I don't buy it as much, but I hear that people say it, is that because Ferdusi did not want to have a strong hero at the level of his Rostam. But I don't buy that. Ferdusi did not invent Rostam. Rostam was in the sources, but Arash, we have other heroes. It's not just Rostam. So we have others. We have Tus, we have Gudars, we have other heroes. It's not just him. So Arash could have been yet another one. But anyway, Fibers, you have a question?
No, about Arash. In the Avesta Tiryash, we have Arash mentioned over there as an archer. And Tiryash is all about the star Tishtariya, which is Sirius. And the body of Arash melting away is when the sun rises, the constellation, which is the constellation of major dog in the Greek philosophy, in the Greek cosmology. In the Persian, Chinese, and Indian cosmology, it was the bow and arrow. There are 7 stars. 6 of them make the bow, and the 7th makes the tip of the arrow. And when the sun comes out, the body goes away slowly, slowly. So that is where Arash's body melts, when he puts all the power in the arrow and he melts away. So it is all about the constellation of Tirokamon, or what the Greeks have called it, the major dog. So it is science. It is science. It is a thesis on the constellation of bow and arrow, which Arash is shooting. The body of Arash is melting away when the sun rises. All that, and from this mountain to that mountain, that is how showing the how the star is traveling. Tishtariya is traveling from one point to the other. So if somebody looks into it from that point of view, it is not a mythology, it's science.
Very interesting perspective. Thank you so much.
And I'll put that up on my website. I'll finish it today, tomorrow, and put it up. You will see, I put all the verses of the Tiryash, and you will see 101% science in that. Nothing of mythology, nothing of prayers. It's all science telling us everything that a stargazer will tell you about the constellation and the star.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
And before answering any question, let me just talk about this project. So Mr. Mirza asked me to give you some project to work on because it seems that you will get a certificate or something. So
actually, sorry, Behram has a question.
I know, but I just wanted to mention
okay,
this.
Sorry.
If somebody wants
you
to,
didn't see him.
No, if somebody wants to leave, they can. So I just want you to hear this one. So I want you to write me a short paper or maybe a recording. Just short paper, maybe just a couple of pages, or just a recording, maybe 5 to 10 minutes of recording, in which I want you to pick one of these 3 subjects and write about it. And in which I would like you to write what you learned from this class and also add your own perspective to it. I would like to hear that as well. So the first topic is this. So I'm going to just paste them also in the chat. I'm sure that Mr. Mirza is going to also forward it to you, but let me just read them first. What is the relationship between Shahnameh and the ancient texts, especially Avesta? Provide examples to show some similarities and differences. It's the first topic. So the second one is, what do we learn about Ferdowsi's life from Shahnameh? And the third one is, what is the legacy of Ferdowsi? Again, I would like to also hear your own perspective, not just what you heard from me, but your own perspective as well. So that's it. Just pick one of these 3 topics and talk about them. And either in a form of just a recording, audio recording or video recording between 5 to 10 minutes, or just 1 or 2 pages of text. That's it. So now,
When is the
please.
due date, Afshin?
No due dates. No due date.
Good question. I don't know. Mr.
No
Mirza,
due
what do you
dates
think?
on this.
What should we put as the deadline?
Oh, actually, you know, considering it's Shahnameh, it could be years and years and
Yes,
years.
I agree.
Sure. Why not?
I think about a couple of weeks would be reasonable.
Okay. 2 weeks from now?
Would that be okay?
Yeah. 2
I
weeks
think we're
from
not
now.
going to be that picky about it. And even if you take a week or so extra, that's fine. But the quicker we do that, the better it would be, because it's fresh in your mind.
Correct.
And since you have been doing it and listening to such wonderful aspects from Afshin, so might as well get it done.
Okay. I'm sorry, Afshin, but I have to leave. But
Mhm.
thank you very, very, very much for a very good session. Enjoyed it thoroughly. And
Thank you.
good to see everyone. And thank you, Tintin, very much again for.
Oh, thank you for joining.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Faribol.
Thank you, Marok. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
By the way,
Thank
for
you.
those who don't know, Marok is the only person who lives where I live. So she's from Seattle. So I'm glad to see a familiar face here. So Faribos is also close by. He is in
Yeah.
Vancouver.
It's a pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Any question?
Yeah, I wanted
We
to
can, by
ask,
the way, we can turn off the recording if you want. So it's too long already. So, and then people that can ask questions. Sorry, go ahead.